The moment my son pointed at me, nearly 200 people turned around at once. He stood on that stage in a tuxedo that cost more than the first car I ever owned, smiling, holding the microphone, describing me to a room full of strangers the way you describe something old you pull out of a closet to get a laugh out of everyone. A retired old man. Boring. In bed by 9. Once called a trip to the hardware store the most exciting thing he'd done all week. The whole room erupted. 200 people in black tie, champagne in hand, laughing at a punchline my son spent 38 years building without ever realizing it. That punchline was me, and I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because it was the only thing I had left to do. But there was one person in that room who wasn't laughing. He sat at table 1, completely still, looking straight at me with the eyes of a man who already knew something the rest of the room did not. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am 71 years old. I have run a business, buried a partner, survived a divorce, raised a son largely alone, and I have never not one time in 7 decades allowed another person to make me feel small. That record held through things that would have broken other men. Until a Thursday night in Chicago, at a gala on Lakeshore Drive, when the person who finally found the crack in it was the one I had spent 35 years building from nothing. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you, not a stranger, but someone who was supposed to see you most clearly, then you already know the particular weight of what I'm about to describe. Stay with me, because the way this ends is the reason I'm telling it. My name is Raymond Caldwell. I live on the South Side. Derek's Gala was his idea naturally. Derek Caldwell, my son, who has always had a remarkable talent for organizing events that happened to showcase Derek Caldwell. His Youth Entrepreneurship Foundation had rented out the Grand Sterling on Lake Shore Drive, which is the kind of venue where the light fixtures alone cost what most people pay in annual rent, and where the waitstaff have perfected the particular expression of someone who finds you vaguely disappointing without being able to say exactly why. $400 a plate, black tie required, 180 guests who all knew each other and none of whom knew me. He called 3 weeks before. His voice had that specific charge it only carries when something is going to benefit him. He said I had to be there. He said it was going to be extraordinary. He said he needed his family present. I should have recognized then that Derek doesn't need people. Derek needs witnesses. But he is my son. So I pressed my gray suit, the one my ex-wife Vivian always said made me look serious in the good way, shined my shoes, and took the red line north because I have never paid for valet parking in 71 years, and I see no reason to begin now. I walked into the Sterling at 7 on a Thursday evening, feeling not proud exactly but present, accounted for, there. He found me during cocktail hour and shook my hand. My own child shook my hand. Said I looked well, said he was glad I could make it, and then someone more important materialized over his shoulder and he was gone mid-sentence, still facing me as he drifted toward them, like a man backing slowly out of a room he had just remembered he didn't need to be in. I raised this man. I thought I drove him to school in the rain without ever being asked. I co-signed his first apartment lease. I sat in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning when he was 9 years old with a fever that genuinely frightened me, and I held it together for both of us because one of us needed to. I did not do those things to be paid back. I did them because that is what you do. But he shook my hand, and something quiet registered the fact, filed it away, and moved on. I had a glass of wine. I ate the bread without negotiating with myself about it, because at 71, the bread is not a moral question. 3 speakers talked about youth entrepreneurship in underserved communities. All 3 were good, real good, and I felt the specific loosening in my chest that comes from witnessing something genuine, and I thought maybe I had been reading Derek wrong. Maybe this was the version of him that I had built, and not the one that had been built over it. Then my son took the stage, and I understood the difference. He looked extraordinary up there. I will say that honestly because it is true, and because dishonesty costs more than it saves. Tall, easy in his tuxedo, that particular comfort in a room that I recognized because he got it from me, though I suspected he had stopped believing that a long time ago. He told 2 jokes, both landed. He spoke about the foundation with what sounded like real feeling, and that loosening in my chest became something warmer. And then he said they were going to do something special tonight. The room leaned in. He asked how many people in the room had a father. Hands rose, laughter. He asked how many had a father they would describe as boring. More laughter, more hands. And then he said he had brought his tonight. And he looked directly at table 12, which I would later understand was the farthest table from the stage, positioned there not by accident, and he pointed at me. Every head in that room turned at once. Stand up, Dad. What do you do? What does a man do when 180 people are all looking at him at the same time, and his son is holding a microphone and smiling the way he smiles, when he knows the room is going where he has pointed it? I stood. I stood the way you stand, when the only alternative costs more than you are willing to pay in public. Ladies and gentlemen, Derek said, meet Raymond Caldwell, retired, South Side Chicago. Watches the same 3 history documentaries on a rotation. Hasn't been to a restaurant without a senior discount in 4 years. And once this is real, I have a witness once described going to a tile store as, and he paused for the full effect, a pretty productive afternoon. The room collapsed. Warm laughter, genuine laughter, the kind that tells itself it is harmless because it doesn't know any better. I stood and I smiled. 71 years of experience has taught me that smiling is sometimes the only dignified response available to a man in a particular kind of trouble. I smiled the way you smile when something is costing you considerably more than you are going to let it show. So here's what we're going to do, Derek said, eyes bright with the pleasure of a performance going exactly right. We're going to auction off a dinner with my boring dad. Foundation pays. Who wants Raymond Caldwell for the evening? Starting at $1, because honestly he gestured toward me with a kind of apologetic comedy timing that landed perfectly. I want to be fair. The room howled. Someone at table 2 shouted $1, and the crowd cheered for them like they had been brave. Do I hear 2? More laughter. My son the auctioneer pointing at bidders with a showman's delight. And I was still standing, still smiling, and somewhere in my chest something very old and very quiet was making a decision. Then a voice came through the laughter like a hand laid flat on a table. $250,000. The room didn't slow. It stopped. Hard, mid-sentence, mid-sip, mid-breath. The string quartet warming up near the far wall stopped. The laughter evaporated so completely it was as though it had never existed. The voice came from the front of the room. Table 1, nearest the windows, where a man in a dark suit had been sitting for the last hour with the absolute stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove to any room anywhere. Late 60s, silver at the temples, no tie. The kind of man who occupies exactly his own space and not 1 centimeter more, which paradoxically makes every eye find him immediately. Derek's grin didn't disappear right away. It took about 4 seconds for his face to catch up to what his ears had received. His mouth stayed in the shape of the smile, while the rest of his expression sorted through what had just happened. He said into the microphone, his voice doing something I had never in 38 years heard it do, cracking at a very specific seam. Did someone say 250,000? The man at table 1 said it again. Same volume, same tone. The unhurried patience of a man who is not accustomed to being asked to repeat himself, and is doing so only as a courtesy. He was already standing. I did not know who he was. I was Raymond Caldwell, 71 years old, retired, standing at table 12 with my dignity hanging by a thread. I had no idea who this man was, or why he had just made that sound on my behalf. But he looked across that room at me, and I looked back at him. And something passed between us that I still find difficult to name a recognition between 2 men who have spent their lives being miscounted, and who have developed, over a very long time, a very particular patience about it. Derek recovered barely. He said we had $250,000 and the game show host had entirely left his voice. Sold to the gentleman at table 1. I sat down. The woman next to me at table 12, who had spent most of the evening staring at her phone, was now staring at me with the specific expression of someone performing a rapid and thorough reassessment. I picked up my wine, took a slow sip, and thought, 71 years, not once. But now I was curious. I was very, very curious. Honestly, if that were me, I don't know if I would have been able to hold it together through the auction. I've thought about it many times since Raymond told me this story. Most of us never get tested quite that precisely in front of that many people, by that specific person. The fact that he just sat back down and picked up his wine, that tells you more about this man than anything else I could say about him. Keep watching, because what comes next is the part that will stay with you. Arthur Nance's assistant called at 8 the following morning. Her name was Helen, and she had the composed efficiency of a person who has spent years being the most capable first line of protection between a very serious man and the rest of the world. We scheduled a breakfast for the following Wednesday at a restaurant on the Gold Coast with no sign visible from the street and a menu with no prices listed. I wore the gray suit. It was becoming a suit with a purpose. Arthur was already seated when I arrived. Same quality of stillness I had seen at table 1. He stood when I approached, shook my hand with the brevity of a man who considers a handshake an exchange of information, not a performance. Coffee arrived without either of us asking. I decided immediately that I liked this place. Arthur said he preferred directness. I told him that so did I. He studied me for a moment with the focused attention of a man who reads people quickly and accurately. Then he said a name, Clarence Webb. I put my coffee down. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in 9 years. Clarence Webb was my oldest friend, my college roommate at Morehouse in 1975, when we were both broke and 20 years old and absolutely certain the world owed us a debt it would eventually be forced to settle. It didn't. We were young enough to find that motivating rather than devastating. 32 years ago, he had sat across from me in a diner on Wabash Avenue, with a paper napkin covered in numbers, and the expression of a man who had run out of options, but had not yet run out of belief. He needed $45,000. He had been everywhere. Every door. Nobody would move. But he knew his idea the way you know your own reflection completely, without the possibility of doubt. He was building a supply chain logistics company, back when that phrase sounded like something an accountant invented to describe being lost in a warehouse. I looked at the napkin. I looked at Clarence. And I thought, this man has not lied to me once in 29 years of friendship. Not once. Not about anything. Not even the small things people lie about by habit. I gave him the money. No contract. No equity agreement. No lawyers involved. A handshake and a wire transfer from an account my ex-wife Vivian did not know existed, because Vivian would have said I had genuinely lost my mind and she would not have been entirely wrong, and I already knew what I was doing, and did not want to spend the weekend arguing about it. 6 months later, Clarence's company had its first major distribution contract. 2 years after that, a second, then a third, then a fourth contract so large it required hiring 60 people in 90 days. When he sold that firm 11 years ago, a transaction that made the front page of the business section and generated a number, I still cannot comfortably say aloud he was worth north of $300 million. I was living on the South Side, retired, watching documentary reruns. We had an understanding between us, established long before any of the success arrived. He had offered to repay me at 100 times the original amount, many times, across many years. I refused every time. Not out of stubbornness, though Vivian would have said stubbornness was involved, because what I had given Clarence was not a loan. It was a bet on a person I trusted completely, and I had never once needed anyone to know I made that bet, or that it had landed exactly where I aimed it. Clarence told me about you 6 years ago, Arthur said. He was putting together the early investor structure for what became the Nance Renewable Infrastructure Group. Clarence was one of the first major investors, and he made it a condition of his participation, not a request. A condition that before any structure was finalized, they locate a man named Raymond Caldwell on the south side of Chicago and make him an offer. Arthur paused. He told me you were the most quietly powerful man he had ever met in his life. I said Clarence always did have a gift for exaggeration. Arthur smiled. The first smile I had seen from him. It looked right on his face, unhurried and genuine, like everything else about him. He said Clarence had also told him that if he ever met me, he should pay close attention, because I was the kind of man who communicated more through what he didn't say than most people managed in a lifetime of conversation. I told him Clarence was very generous. Arthur said Clarence was very accurate. He told me he had watched me at the gala. The entire room was laughing, he said, and I was sitting in that chair absorbing every second of it with more dignity than he had seen any person display in 50 years of business. He had spent those 50 years in rooms full of the most powerful people in this country. He knew that particular expression, the face of a man who has been underestimated so completely, for so long, that he stopped being wounded by it and started finding it instructive. He said he wanted my son to see it. He wanted Derek to understand that the man he had just put on a stage had someone in that room who already knew precisely who he was. I nodded slowly. I was thinking, This is the first time in a very long time that someone has told me they saw me. Not what I could do for them, not what I represented, not what category I belonged in. Just, I saw you. I knew who you were before you walked in. That is a rarer thing than most people recognize. If you have ever worked quietly for decades and felt invisible to the people whose opinion you wanted most, you know exactly what receiving that sentence felt like. Then Arthur slid a folder across the table. 12% equity stake in the Nance Renewable Infrastructure Group. No capital required. My contribution had been made 32 years ago on a Saturday afternoon in a diner on Wabash Avenue, with a paper napkin and a handshake. That wire transfer was the origin point. Without it, Clarence's company doesn't survive its first year. Without Clarence's company, the initial capital structure of the infrastructure fund doesn't exist. The specific number on the first page of that folder is something I will not say here. What I will tell you is that it had enough zeros to make a 71-year-old man from the South Side sit very still for a very long time and quietly understand that his life had a shape he had never fully seen from the quarterman. Inside. I told Arthur I needed to think about it. He said, of course. I asked him why he had stood up at the gala instead of simply calling me. He had Clarence's name. He had the connection. A phone call would have accomplished the same thing without the drama of a $250,000 bid in front of 180 people. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because your son put you in that chair and handed a room full of people permission to laugh at you." And he had watched me absorb every second of it, with more grace than he had witnessed displayed in half a century of professional life. He looked at me directly. He said he thought it mattered that someone in that room acted not later, not privately, but in that exact moment to make clear that the man standing at table 12 was not a punchline, that he was known, that he was worth more than the room understood. I called Arthur the next morning and said yes, with one condition. My son had been trying to get a meeting with Nance Renewable for 2 years. I had heard him mention it at Thanksgiving and again at Christmas, both times pretending I wasn't paying attention, the way he pretended many things around me. I did not want Arthur to take that meeting, not as a favor to me, not as leverage, just not yet. Maybe not ever. That was Arthur's decision to make. But I wanted Derek to know why. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that could be arranged. 6 weeks later, I put the gray suit on for the 3rd time. Derek had called the previous Sunday in his Sunday casual voice the particular register he uses when he needs something and wants the ask to feel like a coincidence. He mentioned Nance Renewable almost offhandedly. Said he had been trying to get their attention for 2 years. Literally nobody got through, but he'd heard they might be opening their door to partnerships with foundations doing infrastructure-adjacent work. He asked if maybe I knew anyone who might know someone. My old network. Whatever. I said I couldn't think of anyone, pleasantly. There was a pause. Then he said I should come to dinner soon. He started to say something else and stopped himself. He said soon. I thought, not yet. Arthur had understood that the architecture of the moment matters as much as the moment itself. Derek had been communicating with a junior associate at Nance for 3 weeks, a carefully managed process that gave him enough hope to show up fully prepared, enough uncertainty to keep him sharp, and enough prestige to bring 2 of his board members. His assistant, a young woman named Priya, who I had met briefly at Christmas, and who had given me her number and said with a sincerity that surprised me that Derek mentioned me more often than he probably realized, had texted me the morning of the meeting. He picked the tie out last night, she wrote. Has been running slides since 6 a.m. I arrived at Arthur Nance's office building at 9:15. 41st floor, Michigan Avenue. The city spread out below like something arranged for your personal reassurance. Helen met me at the elevator and walked me to a side room with coffee and a view that would have made anyone feel briefly like they were in the right place. At the door, she paused and turned back. She said Mr. Nance had told her the full picture of what the meeting was about. She allowed herself the smallest, most controlled smile I have ever witnessed on a professional's face. She said she had worked for him for 12 years and had never once seen him look forward to something with that particular quality of quiet anticipation. Derek arrived at 9:30. I heard him in the corridor performance voice fully deployed, the warmer and slightly faster register he uses when he needs something from someone important. He told someone the space was extraordinary. He said they had followed everything Nance Renewable had built, the infrastructure fund especially. He sounded like himself, the best version of himself, the version I raised. I am aware of the complexity of what I was feeling in that side room. Pride and grief do not cancel each other out. They coexist in the specific way that only fatherhood makes possible, the pride that lives right next to the sorrow of being misunderstood by the person you have given the most of yourself to build. 20 minutes in, Arthur's voice through the wall, asking Derek about the foundation structure, its goals, its long-term model. Derek answering with real intelligence and real passion. I thought, this is who he is when no one is watching. This is the thing underneath the gala, and the microphone, and the pointing. Arthur said he would like to bring in someone who had been involved with the fund from the beginning. A pause. Of course, Derek said. I heard the fractional recalibration in his voice, the microscopic shift that said, "Who else is coming?" Helen opened the side room door and nodded at me. I stood, straightened my jacket, picked up my old leather briefcase, the one Vivian always hated, the one I have carried for 22 years because it has been everywhere I have been, and I see no reason to replace a thing that still does its job. I walked into the conference room. What happened to Derek Caldwell's face in the 5 seconds that followed is something I intend to carry with me for the rest of my life, and I plan to live considerably longer simply for the pleasure of keeping it. The first expression, recognition. That's my father. The second, confusion. Why is my father here? The third, the beginning of arithmetic. Arthur Nance knows my father. The pieces that had seemed like separate facts were beginning to connect in a way that changed everything. The fourth, the one a performer reaches for but cannot quite hold together, the dawning, stomach-dropping understanding that something has been happening for a long time that he did not know about, that the ground beneath him was not the ground he believed it was. "Dad," he said. His voice arrived at about half the volume he had intended for it. "Derek," I said, the way I had said his name every Sunday for 35 years, pleasantly, without drama. I sat across from my son. Arthur sat at the head of the table. And then the door opened one more time, and Clarence Webb walked in. My oldest friend, 68 years old. The man I had not seen in 9 years, who had flown in from Atlanta the previous evening, and who had held me in the corridor outside for a long wordless moment that said everything two men need to say when they have watched each other become whoever they were going to become. Clarence sat to Arthur's right and looked at Derek with the still, assessing gaze of a man worth $300 million who has not forgotten for a single day what it felt like to be worth nothing. I watched Derek recognize the name when Arthur said it. I watched him understand the scale of what Clarence Webb had built across 30 years. And I watched him begin slowly, the way you turn a map right side up after reading it wrong to understand the shape of the room he was sitting in. "Derek," Arthur said, folding his hands on the table with the quiet authority of a man who has run 10,000 meetings and knows precisely how this one ends. "I want to be transparent with you. You deserve to understand the complete picture of this meeting." Derek nodded. The performance had left his face entirely. What remained was my son, 38 years old, suddenly appearing younger than that. "Your father and I are partners," Arthur said. 12% equity in the Nance Renewable Infrastructure Group, finalized 6 weeks ago, because of a decision your father made 32 years ago. A decision without which this fund would not exist in its current form. He let that settle. "I also want you to know that your foundation's work is real. Your proposal has genuine substance. Your team has done serious work. Under different circumstances, this would be a different conversation." He paused, the pause of a man who has chosen his next words with complete precision. "I have been aware of your outreach to this fund for 2 years. I made the decision not to take that meeting. I want you to know why, because I believe you have earned the explanation." Derek was completely still. "The night I met your father," Arthur said, "I watched a 71-year-old man be placed on a stage in front of a room full of strangers by his own son, and made into the evening's entertainment. And I watched him absorb every second of it with more dignity and more grace than I have witnessed any person display in 50 years of professional life." His voice did not rise. It never needed to. I do not do business with people who cannot recognize the value of what is standing directly in front of them. I do not make exceptions to that. The room was so quiet, I could hear the city 41 floors below. Clarence was looking at the table. His jaw was moving almost imperceptibly. Derek's eyes were full. "Dad," just the word, everything else gone. "I know you didn't mean it as cruelty," I said. "I know it was supposed to be a joke." I leaned forward and looked at my son the way I used to when he was small and frightened and needed someone to show him the true shape of things, not the comfortable version, the real one. I need you to hear what I'm about to say the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. He waited. I have never needed you to know what I do quietly. I gave Clarence that money because that is who I am, not because I wanted anyone to find out. I turned down repayment for 32 years because the bet was always about him, never about me. I have lived an entire life of choosing depth over display, and I have never once regretted it. I held his eyes. But I am 71 years old, and I sat in that chair, and 200 people laughed, and you pointed at me, and called me boring in a room full of strangers, and it cost me something. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. Derek's jaw tightened. His eyes didn't leave mine. So here is what is going to happen. I stood and buttoned my jacket. I am going to go home. I'm going to find something genuinely interesting at the hardware store, and you are going to sit with everything in this room. I looked at him steadily. Not as punishment, as information, about who your father is, about what quiet looks like when it has been paying attention this whole time. I picked up my briefcase. Your foundation is good work, Derek. Real work. Keep doing it. But you'll need to find your own path to investors. That isn't cruelty. That is just the correct thing. I reached across the table and put my hand on my son's shoulder briefly, firmly, the way fathers do when they love someone completely, and are also furious with them and do not yet have a single word that contains both of those things at once. Then I shook Arthur Nance's hand, and I hugged Clarence Webb properly, the way you hug a man you have known for 50 years in front of whoever is watching, because at 71 I hug my friends and I do not apologize for it. 50 years, Clarence said quietly into my shoulder. 50 years, I said. At the door, Arthur said my name. I turned. He looked at me with the same expression I had seen once before at table 1 on a Thursday night, just before he stood up. Quiet respect. The kind that does not need to announce itself. Friday dinner, he said. Somewhere without prices on the menu. Obviously, I said. The corner of his mouth moved. I walked out, took the elevator down 41 floors, pushed through the glass doors onto Michigan Avenue. Chicago received me the way it always does. Loudly, without interest in anyone's private seismic events, magnificently indifferent to what had just happened 41 floors above the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment and let the city move over me. November air, cold and specific. The way Chicago cold is specific, not just temperature but intention, the kind of cold that has made its position on softness very clear. The buses, the people, the whole impossible machine of a city that has never once considered pausing for any individual human story. In my inside jacket pocket was a document my accountant Gerald, a careful and deeply conservative man who had never in 28 years managing my modest finances used a word that could be described as excitable, had described as the kind of thing that changes the shape of a life. Derek would rebuild. I know my son. He is stubborn in the way that people who are actually capable tend to be stubborn, because they have evidence. He is talented in ways he has not yet fully discovered. And underneath the gala and the microphone and the pointing and the joke, he is the boy I raised, the boy I drove to school in the rain without being asked, the boy I sat next to in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. while he slept through a fever that I would have traded for a physical wound if I could have. He will turn what happened in that conference room over for a long time. He will turn it every direction. And eventually, not soon, but eventually he will understand it the way it needed to be understood. A danger. I as a lesson imposed from outside, as a recognition of who his father always was. And when he is ready, I will be on the south side, where I have always been. I took the red line home, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time since a Thursday night on Lakeshore Drive, when my own son held up a microphone and offered me to a room full of strangers for the price of a cup of coffee, Raymond Caldwell felt completely and exactly like himself. Not boring. He was never boring. He was just quiet. And the thing about quiet men, the thing that Derek Caldwell was only now beginning to understand, 41 floors up on Michigan Avenue, with Clarence Webb's eyes on the table and Arthur Nance's words still moving through the room, is that quiet is not the same thing as absent. Quiet men see everything. Quiet men remember everything. And quiet men, when they finally decide the moment has arrived, when they button their jacket and pick I will briefcase and walk out of a room they have just completely rearranged. They don't look back. They have never needed to. I want to ask you something before you go. Drop a number in the comments right now. Leave a 1 if you think Raymond did the right thing by not intervening for his son's foundation. Leave a 2 if you think he should have helped Derek anyway. And leave a 3 if this story reminded you of someone in your own life. A parent, a friend, someone you may have underestimated. I genuinely want to know where you land on this. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment on this channel, and I mean that. If you've ever been the quiet one in a room full of loud people, if you've ever done something meaningful that no one around you knew about, if you've ever let the work speak from a distance and wondered whether anyone was listening, this channel is for you. Every story here is for you. Subscribe if you haven't already. It costs you nothing, and it means more than I know how to say in a sentence. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Chicago, Illinois, to create original content. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.